Bombshell testimony from someone who reportedly saw how Diddy operated from the inside. Sean Combs' former personal assistant took the stand in his former boss's sex trafficking and racketeering trial. He claims to have set up and even cleaned up hotel rooms that were covered in baby oil and Astroglide lubricant. Here are pictures of some of that lubricant found at Combs' Miami mansion in a raid. Not to mention, before this witness's testimony, he tried to plead the fifth. What he didn't want to say in open court, just feet away from his former boss, a former boss that could spend the rest of his life in federal prison. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. When I say the name George Kaplan, it doesn't really have the same pop as Cassie or Kid Cudi or Diddy. But when you're looking at the trial of Sean Diddy Combs accusing him of sex trafficking and racketeering, the name George Kaplan matters a good bit because George Kaplan was incredibly close to Diddy during a very crucial time in the government's case. Here's a picture of George Kaplan entering the federal courthouse in Manhattan this week. Kaplan worked for Combs Enterprises from 2013 to 2015, which is the umbrella company that oversaw everything Sean Diddy Combs, from his music to his liquor brands to his clothing brands. Kaplan says he started out as a personal assistant to other executives at the company, but then in 2014, he worked directly for Sean Diddy Combs as a personal assistant, the person that he first called in court the chairman. So far in this case, we have seen witnesses who were singers and rappers and even escorts. These were people who were in Sean Combs' inner circle, a man who's accused of running a sex trafficking and racketeering operation. But Kaplan came from a very different background. He was brought into Diddy's circle because he started his career at Nickelodeon, the kids' TV channel. He said his boss at Nickelodeon moved over to work at Combs Enterprises, and then Kaplan came with him. Eventually, Kaplan worked his way up to work directly for Sean Diddy Combs. Kaplan detailed some wild, over-the-top things that he had to do when he worked for Diddy, and some of them were illegal. Before his testimony on Wednesday, Kaplan said he planned to plead the fifth in order not to incriminate himself while answering certain questions. The government found his answers to be so important, they requested that Kaplan be given immunity, and the judge granted him that. Kaplan went into detail about the intense hours that he worked and the over-the-top requests that he had to fulfill for Sean Combs. He said he was paid $125,000 a year. Now, when you hear that money, you have to wonder whether it was worth it. Before we get back to what's happening in the courtroom in New York, I do want to bring you a Law&Crime legal alert, because if you received a Depo-Provera birth control shot and you were later diagnosed with a spinal or a brain tumor called meningioma, you may be eligible for a lawsuit. Morgan & Morgan is investigating claims that patients weren't properly warned about the risk. It is free to check, it takes just a few minutes, and you don't pay unless they win. So scan the QR code on your screen. You can also click the link in the description or go to forthepeople.com/LCDEPO to see if you qualify. Kaplan said that he worked between 80 to sometimes 100 hours a week for Diddy on average. Sometimes work would start at 9:30 in the morning, but he wouldn't be done until 7 o'clock in the morning the next day. In some ways, Kaplan was really just a gopher for Combs. He would run errands, pick up prescriptions, get Combs food if he was hungry, and also make sure that his office was ready each day. He would even set up Diddy's toiletries in his bathroom and make sure they were all facing forward. But he also said that Combs would regularly threaten his job. The first time that happened, he said, was just a week into his position working directly for Sean Combs. Diddy asked him to go get a gallon of BPA-free water from Whole Foods. Kaplan says when he got to the grocery store, they were out of gallon versions of that water, so he bought 2 half gallons to make 1 full gallon, and that just set Diddy off. Kaplan said Diddy would actually threaten his job on a monthly basis. Now, while that anecdote, it might remind you of the reality show Making the Band on MTV, when Diddy sent the contestants to go get him cheesecake miles away in Brooklyn, and they had to do it on foot. All of that, while sensational, maybe harsh, it's not illegal. But then Kaplan started answering questions that put him in the middle of several scenes that the government is trying to paint in this trial. One of Kaplan's main duties was that he set up the hotel rooms that Diddy would stay at. He said his goal was to make it feel like home for Combs, and he would take a hotel bag and then unpack it in the room. Kaplan said that Diddy's bag would have clothes, a speaker, candles, liquor, baby oil, Astroglide, that's a lubricant, and if you have been following this trial, you might know where we're going. Baby oil and Astroglide are two of the alleged main ingredients that were used in the freak-off parties at the center of this trial. The drug-fueled sex parties that involved escorts that would go on for hours. According to Diddy's ex-girlfriend Cassandra Ventura, who has already testified in this trial, she was a star government witness. Here's a picture of Astroglide lubricant that was found in Diddy's Miami mansion when it was raided by federal agents in March of last year. Not only did Kaplan set up Diddy's hotel room, he would also clean it up after Combs left. The prosecutor asked Kaplan what he remembered about cleaning up the hotel rooms, and he said, quote, lots of empty bottles, empty Gatorade bottles, empty liquor bottles, and often baby oil, which he said would be on the table, on the floor, on the bed, around the room. He also said one time he saw a brown crystallized powder in the hotel room, which he got rid of. Kaplan also said he would clean up the hotel rooms before the housekeeping staff would get there in order to help protect Sean Diddy Combs' image so someone couldn't take a picture of a dirty hotel room or one filled with baby oil and then sell it to a tabloid. Kaplan said when Diddy was in a hotel, which sometimes would be for multiple days, that's when he would go home to rest, so he says he was not there during the alleged freak-offs. Kaplan also talked about going and buying drugs for Diddy. Kaplan said on one occasion he bought Diddy the party drug MDMA. He said Diddy gave him a phone number and some cash, and then Kaplan called the number, had a man come by Diddy's house, gave the man the cash, and the man gave Kaplan a bag full of pills, which he believed were MDMA. He also talked about another instance when he bought substances for Diddy, but he didn't know exactly what those substances were. MDMA, though, is one of the drugs that was found in Diddy's Miami mansion in that raid, according to federal agents. And one of Diddy's former personal assistants testified this week that Combs took drugs throughout the day, almost every day. Percocets in the morning, and then he'd switch to more party drugs like ecstasy and MDMA at night. Kaplan also testified that he witnessed Combs abuse Cassandra Ventura. He said it happened on a private jet, and Combs asked Kaplan to get cream to conceal the bruising on Cassie's face. The prosecution asked Kaplan why he didn't intervene, and he said it was because of concerns over his career. He also talked about an incident when Combs allegedly threw green apples at a former girlfriend named Gina in the hallway of his Miami mansion. Kaplan testified he eventually left his job with Combs Enterprises partly because he no longer wanted to cover things up. On cross-examination, he did tell the defense that he had respected Combs as an entrepreneur. They also questioned whether he actually saw the incidents of Cassie being abused allegedly on the jet and Gina having apples thrown at her allegedly at that home in Miami by Sean Combs. Joining us now to talk more about this is retired FBI agent Bobby Chacon. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Let's talk about this witness, George Kaplan. Not a household name. He's not a performer or a superstar like some of the other people that we've seen on the stand. Why is he an important witness, though, when you look at the story the government's trying to tell?
Sure, Chris. Well, I mean, on the outside, a guy like this looks like very much on the bottom of the totem pole in a case like this with all the people around this case. But he serves a crucial role, even though he doesn't seem like the most well-known name, because sometimes the personal assistants, who are almost anonymous for most of the time, serve like a crucial role, especially in this case. You know, we've heard testimony that he prepped the hotel rooms before Diddy got there. That means he made sure there was baby oil and lubricant and the things and alcohol and things like that. And then following up on that, after these so-called freakouts would take place in these hotel rooms, he would clean it up. You know, and the question was posed to him, like, why not let the hotel, housekeeping staff clean it up? Well, there was stuff in there like, this copious amounts of sexual lubricant and things like that that would kind of tarnish a popular public figure's reputation. So he said his job was to kind of protect Diddy's reputation and get all of that stuff out of there. He wasn't making the beds per se, but he was cleaning up all that other stuff that someone would come in and say, wow, what is all this? It looks like there was a sexual orgy in here last night.
And what stood out to me too, and I know it's the prosecutors who are trying this case in court, but I think of the federal agents who built this case and were identifying some of the key players who would play a part in the prosecution's work. You have Cassie describing these freak off events, and others who have talked about it, some of the male escorts. But then here's someone also, and it's like corroborating some of the details. You have the baby oil that's in the room, and there was a lot of it. There was this Astroglide sexual lubricant, and there was a lot of that. And then that backs it up. It seems like he is someone, if you're a juror and you were like, this sounds way too wild to be true, in comes George Kaplan backing it up.
Yeah, well, you hit the nail on the head for prosecutions. It's all about corroboration. So, like, each witness doesn't stand on their own because the defense team tries to attack each witness and undermine their credibility. So that person's not telling the truth. They had a reason to lie. They had motivation. But when you start each independent witness, especially corroborating each other, they don't know each other. They have never talked to each other, and so, but what they're saying all ties together. And then you have physical evidence obtained by the federal agents who did the search warrants that also bolster the testimony of some of these witnesses. So it starts to build a case. It's like a web it builds for the prosecution that it's really hard to attack. The defense has a hard time attacking that because even if you try to attack each witness individually, in closing arguments, the prosecution is going to say you can believe this witness because not because they said it themselves, but because what they said was corroborated by another witness who they weren't in cahoots with. It was corroborated by the physical evidence that the federal agents found in his house. Like, for example, you talk about the Astroglide. If his assistant comes in and says, yeah, I would clean up all the Astroglide in the hotel room, and then the federal agent comes in and says, we found a case of Astroglide in his house, that kind of corroborates that testimony. So it works together. So it elevates their credibility, elevates their believability for the jury.
And I want to get to some of the physical evidence that federal agents found at his house in Miami in just a moment. But one more bit on Kaplan, because I think everybody's had a tough boss in their life, but never to the point of some of the stories that he was telling. He said he worked 100 hours a week in some cases. And then there's this anecdote about the Whole Foods. He was supposed to go get a special type of water in a gallon, came back with 2 half gallons, and Diddy was upset about that. He threatened his job on a monthly basis. Some could look at that and be like, Sean Combs is just a really tough boss. As a federal agent and you're building a case, what stands out to you when you hear stories like that? And along with, of course, we hear more stories of physical abuse against some of his partners. No physical abuse against Kaplan, but these types of stories, what stands out to you?
Well, it's again back to corroboration. It's like building a picture of who this person is. So you have to add little pieces. So again, you're not just hearing it from one person that Diddy was a intense individual, you might say. So it's believable that somebody that's a really hard boss, and when we say hard, like you said, he was told to go get a gallon bottle from Whole Foods of this BPA free, which is a type of plastic that doesn't have contaminants or less contaminants. And he came back with the same thing, but they didn't have the gallon. So he bought 2 half gallons, and Diddy got in his face about it and said, I'm used to getting what I want. So he's really like an overbearing boss and right in his face, just short of violence. Like when somebody's like face to face with you, nose to nose, as he describes, it's just short of violence. So it's building this character profile of Diddy. And this is just another piece that kind of lays the foundation that this guy was an intense guy. He would get in people's faces, even his personal assistant, for the most minor infraction, if you will, of behavior. Diddy would consider that, really, he would take it personally. And so he would get in his face and get, just short of violence. And then you have other witnesses come and saying he was violent. So it's all about building blocks. And this is kind of laying the foundation for who this person, Diddy was.
And we see, we have dozens of pictures of some of the evidence that the government is now presenting in this trial from when they raided Diddy's house in Miami. This was March 2024. I know you looked through some of those pictures. We have as well, but I mean, you were a federal agent. You have done these types of raids. What stands out to you with what the agents were able to get at that house?
Well, it seems to me, and I've done hundreds of raids just like that. And those pictures really kind of brought me back to the days when I was doing those kind of searches. Um, what stood out to me was, especially having read last week's testimony and yesterday's testimony, when I looked at those pictures last night, it fits the picture that the prosecution's building through the testimony. So and that's what the marriage between the investigators and the prosecutors are all about. The prosecutors want to build this narrative, paint this story, and the federal agents go out and get the paint and the brushes so that the prosecutors can paint the story in the courtroom. And so when you look at those pictures, they're corroborating the witnesses who said, we had this kind of stuff. We had baby oil, we had Astroglide. Sure enough, there's the Astroglide in the picture in his house. There's the baby oil in his closet. So again, it's like perfect stuff to corroborate and bolster the testimony that you're going to have. I liken it to the paint and the brush, and then you give that stuff to the prosecutors who paint the picture in the courtroom.
There are some items too that stood out to me, and if you could just take us into the mind of one of the agents during this raid, because there's a ton of these like high heel platform shoes, and to the untrained eye, you could be like, well, this guy, he just lives kind of a fast life, and here's just a ton of shoes, and he's rich, and he just has them in the house. How do you know? Certainly based off the stories and the evidence you have going in, but how do you know to look for items that are not illegal, but they play into something that you're arguing is illegal when it gets to trial?
Yeah, well, on the federal level, we were always kind of working with the prosecutors early on in the investigation, whereas sometimes the locals kind of don't meet the prosecutors till after an arrest. So during the investigation, you're working with your prosecutors. In fact, to get a search warrant, you go to the U.S. Attorney's Office and work with an assistant U.S. attorney to get that search warrant. So that the narrative that the prosecutors are going to build in the courtroom already starts early on in the investigation. So when you go to execute a search warrant, you kind of know what you're looking for. In fact, there's a constitutional requirement of specificity in a search warrant. You have to kind of list the things that you're going to seize, and it's kind of listed in the search warrant. And so it depends on the crime alleged, and the search warrant will say we believe evidence of these particular crimes are in this. So if you're talking about sex trafficking and you're talking about sexual blackmail and things like that is the narrative, then when you come across these shoes that kind of, maybe exotic dancers a lot of times will use, and those kind of shoes, when you're talking about the narrative of these freak offs, which they already knew when they executed the search warrant, they knew about the freak offs and they knew they were going to be a part of the story that's told in the courtroom. Those are the things you want to see. So whatever these big sex parties were, that led to the freak offs at the end of the party, whatever, how it happened, you want to seize anything that is of that nature. So if there were exotic dancers, if there were, escorts involved in your narrative, then if these are something that people like that would wear to one of those parties, that's when you want to take, because maybe he brought people in and had them wear particular types of shoes that he wanted them to wear. So he had those shoes at his house. So, you're seizing things that are, and these are the things that aren't necessarily criminal. Obviously, they found guns, they found drugs, they found bullets, and those things are the easy ones you take, right? You take the cocaine and you take
Yeah.
the all the other stuff, but the stuff that is not of a criminal nature, but also tells the story, like the Astroglide. It's not illegal to have baby oil, but if part of your narrative is we had these parties and people poured baby oil all over each other, then you seize the baby oil, even though it's not illegal. You seize it because it's part of the story, part of the narrative of what you're going to tell in court.
And Sean Combs's defense is really, a lot of his attorneys have said, if you've seen the assault video that CNN had from the hotel in 2016, yeah, it's bad, but this isn't a domestic violence case. There were drugs that were found in the home, MDMA, cocaine, according to federal agents, but this isn't a drug case. How do those items, the drugs that were found in the house in Miami, factor into the argument that he was running a sex ring and that this was a criminal enterprise that Sean Combs was running?
Well, here's how they factor into that. So the sex ring and the sex trafficking allegations include the fact that he would drug some of these people and get them to a point where they either couldn't consent or they were almost incapacitated, and then he would have them perform for him on camera, and then maybe take them across state lines, take them, say, and this doesn't have to be like in a darkened van driving across some. Yeah, this can be getting on a plane and flying from Los Angeles to Miami or vice versa, or to Vegas, as long as it crosses state lines for the purpose of, this sexual activity. That's sex trafficking. And so if the person doesn't have the ability to consent, or you're using these drugs to get them incapacitated, that's part of the scheme of getting them to the point where they'll do things that you want them to do that they wouldn't do if they didn't have those drugs in their system. So you take those drugs, you seize those drugs as part of this overall scheme of getting people drugged, and getting them to do what you want them to do, perform for you on camera, travel with you, or whatever it is. So that's, again, part of that story the prosecutor's telling as far as the sex trafficking charges.
And as far as the drugs, just kind of turning to that, because he had them in baggies, MDMA. He's accused to have, done ecstasy in the past. You have cocaine. If I was caught with those things, I would be charged, and I would be in pretty tough trouble with the law. Sean Combs is not facing drug charges. Why is that? This is just a sex trafficking case. This is not a case related to him buying drugs or using drugs.
Yeah, I think mainly because when I was working drugs in the federal government, we had thresholds. You had to have, you usually want drug trafficking charges. Those bring the heaviest penalties. We don't really charge drug use cases at the federal level. So the amounts of cocaine there, this is not like they raided, a Colombian cartel leader's home in Miami and they had a garage full of kilos of cocaine. This was more of, again, to be used for not personal use, because it was a little more than that, but these were used to have these parties. It was part of the parties. So the MDMA, the ecstasy, even the cocaine was all part of this narrative of these drug-fueled parties that led to the trafficking, the sexual trafficking, and the other charges. So it's not necessarily a drug case. They didn't find, huge amounts of drugs that they could charge him with drug trafficking. These were the end users of the drugs. Excuse me. Those drugs weren't being sold to other people per se. So those weren't the federal charges that they were interested in, because they were very small amounts of drugs in the context of a federal drug trafficking charge. And so that's why he's not charged with drug trafficking.
And we're still, Bobby, on the front end of this trial. It's expected to go for another 6 or maybe 7 weeks. But to this point, you see the evidence that's been presented. You see the evidence that the government has, some of the testimony that we've been hearing from the courtroom. At this point, how strong do you feel about the case that the prosecution is making? Because Sean Combs, he has an all-star team of lawyers that are trying to say, okay, this isn't a domestic violence case. This isn't a drug case. He's a swinger. And that's really all that's happening here. What's just your takeaway through the first couple of weeks of what we've seen and heard?
Well, I think it's a strong case so far. Again, it's a good thing you pointed out. We're very early in this process, but so far, Cassie was a very important witness, and the defense didn't really hurt her as much on cross-examination as I think they might have hoped. I think she's a believable witness. I think she's a witness who the jury's going to have sympathy for. And so I don't think the defense has hurt many of the witnesses so far on cross-examination. But again, it's early in this trial. Anything can happen. I was a juror 2 years ago on a 5-month murder trial. And, as the trial moves on, different things happen. So it's like you got to tune into this thing every day if you want to really see the story unfold, because, any day can be a banner day for either side. One witness can explode or whatever. And so I think so far, so good. But as you said, we're very early in the trial.
Wow. So as a retired FBI agent, they kept you on the jury for that trial.
On a murder trial with special circumstances, which is the highest charge we have here in California. And yeah, I ended up being the jury foreman. And not only am I a former FBI agent, I'm an attorney. So they kept me on the jury, and I wound up being the jury foreman. And yeah, it was a 5.5 month murder trial. So I know that. I know the side of it as a juror now, which has really opened my eyes to how I see trials and stuff as a juror.
Yeah, and they're long days too that these jurors are going through, where even though we're all captivated by the transcript, the courtroom is not the most stimulating place all the times, especially once they
we get to see only the highlights. It's like right. A sports show. You get to see the highlights, but man, those jurors are sitting through a lot of testimony that isn't so exciting.
Yeah, and that's also an important part to think about too. Is for as much as all the highlights, it still comes down to those people in the jury box and the decisions that they make. Retired FBI agent Bobby Chacon, always great to have you on Law and Crime. Hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, Chris.
Combs' trial is expected to last another 6 or 7 weeks. He's charged with racketeering, sex trafficking by force, and transportation to engage in prostitution. He has pleaded not guilty to all charges. That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.